Hello, Wawas.
Wow, 这么凶
Little Wawas.
So cute.
Hello.
Hi guys, this video is about my most recent trip to Taiwan, especially our day trip to Tainan. I have family living in Taiwan. My uncle lives in Kaohsiung with his wife and kids, my cousins. Also, before they passed away, my grandparents lived there too. Every year or two since I was literally too young to remember it, I visited the country. And one day I really needed to make a video about Kaohsiung too, but it's one of those situations where I don't really feel like a tourist there because, you know, it's a place I'm so familiar with from visiting family that it's hard to see it like someone who's there as a visitor. This is all I had to say about the city during this trip. So for now, yeah, I'll show you the view from my hotel window. It's pretty nice up here. This is the city of Kaohsiung. To be honest, if it were nice sunny weather, I could probably show it to you more at its best. But still, yeah, compared to when we used to come here 15 plus years ago, you know, the place has developed a lot, and especially this road we're on, it's getting more and more gentrified every year. There's lots of brand new buildings and some pretty old ones too. So yeah, I actually do recommend visiting, which I probably wouldn't have done 10 years ago. So we were there for Mother's Day, my grandma's last one before she passed away. So, you know, it's a good memory for me. She didn't look healthy at all in the pictures we took during this trip, of course, so here's an old picture of me with her. And here's one that has Grandpa in it as well. Part of the trip this time was going to Tainan, which is, I guess you'd say, Kaohsiung's neighbouring city to the north. Before I talk about our trip there though, well, I feel like I'd be remiss without first mentioning one of the best things about visiting relatives in the Chinese diaspora, and that's that we get a lot of food.
This is where we get our breakfast. It's a bao and hei song sarsaparilla.
Here's some of the super delicious meals we ate, as well as some of the more notable decor of the restaurants we went to. That pudding disguised as a pot of soil was definitely a highlight. And yes, it was just pudding, I think. I wouldn't just eat soil without realizing, would I? Alright, let's talk about Tainan. This was the second time I'd visited the city, though it had been almost a decade since last time. Tainan has a lot of interesting history, being the island's first urbanized area, founded by the Dutch before they were ousted by the Chinese, and later a site of rebellion against the occupying Japanese forces. It's a place with a rich history, so when we heard the first place we'd be visiting was a museum, I was pretty happy. But it was not the traditional Chinese building I had expected. We're being tourists today, so we've come to the Tainan Metropolitan Museum. This very striking edifice is the Metropolitan Museum, or Chimei Museum, after the company that made all the money to purchase the collection it houses. The museum was founded in 1992, but this faux European monstrosity opened in 2014. When I saw this instead of some grand old traditionally Chinese structure, or even some Corbusier-esque concrete block, I have to say my first instinct was to get just a little bit sarcastic. Mighty Poseidon holding aloft his... oh, nothing. Bacchus, right? No, Hermes. Actually, Bacchus, or Dionysus, was there, and I'm just showing my ignorance, because Dionysus is the baby Hermes is holding. The main figure is indeed Hermes, and if I were an expert in classical sculpture, I'd have recognised that. It's based on an original excavated from the Temple of Hera at Olympia, and to be fair, it should be called Hermes with the infant Dionysus. Plus, The reason Poseidon was holding nothing is in imitation of the Poseidon of Melos. Though I would question why a derivative work should imitate a Hellenistic original having a part missing. But yeah, generally this bridge of somewhat dubious imitation classical sculpture made me think this was some terrible nouveau riche attempt at Occidental high culture. And honestly, that exterior, I certainly haven't changed my mind about that. It's very Disneyland. If anything, it's substantially less convincingly European in feeling than the Venice-themed section of Disney Sea. But it's not without reason that Forbes called what's inside one of the world's most surprising art collections. Though I didn't know that at this point, and my skepticism continued once we went in.
It's hyper-realism, art in Taiwan. Oh, this is a good frog. Yeah, focus. Yeah, good frog. This is a very oddly curated museum. Giraffes in there, and then some statues here, and then weapons over there.
But while the layout is, I'd say, a little naive, this museum was actually not to be sneered at. It houses just a portion of the collection of Xu Wenlong, whose net worth is about $1.6 billion US. It houses the world's largest collection of violins, including 4 Stradivariuses. Or should that be Stradivarii? No, it shouldn't. And the Western Arts collection is nothing to be sneezed at either. Here's some thoughts from the site itself, though please excuse the sound quality.
Well, I have to say, this place kind of won me over. You know, I was scoffing at first when we arrived. It seemed like a kind of vulgar recreation of European-style architecture with some kind of dodgy sculpture when we were coming in, but the art collection was actually really good. They had a really nice big Burne-Jones tapestry. They had good representation of Buguero. They had ceramics by Picasso and sculpture by Dali and Rodin. They had lots of good stuff actually. Dutch school was well represented. There was a nice Jan Bruegel the Younger. I don't know why I just said that in a French accent. But yeah, pleasantly surprised basically. That'll teach me don't judge a book by its cover.
Not totally sold on the taxidermy penguins though. There's definitely a cautionary tale here. Don't be too quick to mock just because something looks like a tacky nouveau riche folly from the outside and hits you around the face with its stuffed elephants as you go inside. You might just have some masterpieces tucked away, and maybe it's not that helpful to be a snobby, patronising European about people who want to make grand gestures.
I did feel a little bit guilty about having been so judgmental at the beginning, but to be fair, this was a very weirdly curated museum. Nothing about walking in past these reproductions, slightly dodgy Victorian sculptures, and then seeing a large taxidermy section on one wing, and then armour and weapons right next to that on the other, made me think that, you know, there'd be Van Dycks upstairs, but again, you can't judge a book by its cover. So that was unexpectedly not bad. Much better than I thought it would be. Now it's time for lunch.
Bustling streets like these are what I think of when I picture Taiwanese street food. So of course, we tried some local specialties.
Guava, some beef. Now we have deep fried oyster. And some more beef. What is this?
A rice cake.
Some rice cake. I'm not sure about presentation, but tastes good. Now we're having this traditional bean yolk jelly in this traditional restaurant with minions and this little custard fork. Good. Many shops here are called Yongla. 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 That's my name in Chinese.
I should probably explain that a little bit. Yongla is not a translation of my name, or even what I consider my Chinese name to be. It's actually a slightly convoluted story. So when my brother and I were born, my parents gave us English names and Chinese names, officially as middle names. Pretty much the same system my mum and her siblings had when they were kids growing up Catholic. My mum had a super interesting upbringing, but that's a story for another time. They gave me a name meaning eternal happiness, which is what those characters I just showed you actually mean. In the dialect my mother grew up speaking, Fuqiao, a subdialect of Min Chinese, the pronunciation is Yun Lo. So that, or a slightly anglicised Yun Lok, is what I count as my Chinese name. It got slightly more complicated as apparently my grandmother thought it would be lucky to change the yun part to the very similar character for money, yun. So for many years I thought it was written that way, and I even have a Chinese chop that's as old as I am with those characters. Actually, yeah, I can show you. Here we go, can you see? It's jade, and it's actually something that's very special to me. But yes, it has the yuan of money here. Dip, 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 and stamp. See? Money. Can you see that? Just trust me, it's the yuan version. But the thing is, most Chinese people's reaction to money happy is that it's not really a name. Yun Lok is, but it's also the name of an emperor, in Mandarin pronounced not Yun Lok, but Yong Le, which I like because it looks funny in English characters. The Yongle Emperor He was the third Ming emperor, his father having risen up in rebellion against the ruling Mongols at the time. So yeah, Money Happy doesn't really sound like a name, and my proper name is also a little bit weird because, well, it's not exactly an emperor's name, it was the name an emperor chose for his period of rule, his regnal name, I guess you could call it, thus his official posthumous designation as an emperor. Either way, that's the story of my funny Chinese name, and the reason it was written everywhere in this district where we got the food was that it happens to be called the Yongle Market. I guess it's kind of like being excited that a place is called Bryan Street. Hey, it was exciting for me, okay? We headed further into the city for the next activity.
Now we've come to this temple and then we're going on a river cruise. That should be quite nice.
Yeah, cruise was just the first of several ways this little jaunt was exaggerated to me. We were sat on little plastic stools on these funny barges with a crowd of other tourists, and a conical hat was plunked on my head.
I can't appropriate my own culture.
We passed various fauna and some vaguely scenic mangrove trees before reaching an apparently historical site.
Apparently this is the old tax bureau.
According to the internet, this is just a total fabrication made up for tourists, and this was not the remains of a Qing dynasty customs bureau, but just a Japanese water pump for the sake of what this whole scenic waterway actually was. A drainage ditch.
I'm not sure that was worth 10,000 mosquito bites.
There was some more to see at the location though.
There was this big old tree as well, and for some reason a little museum with a skeleton of a sperm whale in it. These kind of funny little dusty museums are kind of what I think of when I think of visiting Taiwan, even though of course it's modernized a lot since I was a kid.
Next was a familiar historical site.
We've been here before, but this is Fort Zeelandia, one of the old Dutch forts here in, where are we? Tainan?
Well, that's sure how to establish a brand as a knowledgeable traveller. And actually, this is properly known as Anping Fort. It is often labelled Fort Zeelandia after the old Dutch militarised trading base that used to stand here. Though they tend to overlap in tourist information, what you see here is actually rather newer.
And these are the original walls. All this was rebuilt by the Japanese.
While what we visited may not be quite as historic as I feel I was led to believe, this is still an extremely important site for Taiwanese history. Long ago, Taiwan was inhabited by its indigenous tribes, who, in a perhaps over-familiar story, haven't been treated all that well historically. They mostly resisted any incursion by the mainland Chinese, though in the early 1600s, 1 or 2 thousand Han Chinese, mostly fishermen, had some short-term settlements. The Dutch East India Company set up a fort here in 1622 and found it excellently placed for trading with East Asia. They brought over a number of Chinese labourers, and they also fought off the Spanish, who tried to start a colony in the north of the island. The Dutch are often labelled invaders within Taiwan, and while not exactly false, they're not really local people, I think that is a little bit misleading. The Dutch prospered here until the arrival of Koxinga. Now, Koxinga is an extremely interesting figure, revered both in Taiwan and mainland China, especially in Fujian, where they have this huge statue of him. He was actually born in Japan, the son of a Hoklo Chinese pirate slash merchant slash military leader who had converted to Christianity and was called Nicholas. and a woman from Kyushu. As a child, Koxinga's name was apparently Hukumatsu. He moved to China at the age of 7 with the name Zheng Sen, Zheng being his father's pre-conversion name, which he probably used day to day. His father was well respected by the emperor by this point, and young Sen became an imperial scholar. But when the Ming were overthrown by the Qing, the remnants of the Ming court fled, attempting to set up a new government with a new emperor in Fuqiao, the city. There, the alternative emperor gave Zheng Sen the title of Koxinga and the new name of Zheng Chenggong. When it was clear the remnants of the Ming were getting stamped out, Zheng's father surrendered to the Qing, but Koxinga himself went to find a new base, taking his father's substantial army with him. That Dutch castle on the nearby island looked pretty tempting and was in a good strategic spot. So Koxinga's 400 ships and 25,000 men starved out the 2,000 odd Dutch. Koxinga moved in and did standard warlord stuff like taking a missionary's daughter as his concubine, or sex slave to use the less euphemistic term, while executing her dad. Thus began the new Chinese rule over the island. Now, Koxinga was still a rebel, being a thorn in the Qing's side for a while, but history has remembered him as a very heroic, maverick figure, and given that he fled from rebellion, established a government in the name of the old leaders, and continued to resist the new regime in China from Taiwan, it's not hard to see why he would be seen as heroic there, if you know Taiwan's more recent history. But that's a whole other kettle of fish, and I've already gone into way more depth than I should have here, given that the only other footage that I have of the fort is this view from the lookout tower.
There we go, a view from above.
After a quick browse of the atmospheric markets nearby, we went on to my favourite location of the day.
Now we're in what they call the Anping Tree House. There's lots of big old trees growing here. It's an old British warehouse, and it's famous for having been completely taken over by these trees.
The warehouse was built in 1867 by British traders, Tate and Company, once the Qing government had opened Taiwan to international trade. The Qing had wrested Taiwan from Koxinga's grandson way back in 1683, and the island had been considered part of China since then. But after the warehouse had been in operation for almost 30 years, new rulers came to the island. At the end of the First Sino-Japanese War, fought mostly in modern-day Korea, the Japanese invaded Taiwan, and as victors, it became their territory right up until they surrendered to the Americans at the end of World War II. The Japanese took over the trade Tate and Company had been engaged in, so when that company left the country, the warehouse was abandoned. Before long, the banyan trees took over, leaving the rather picturesque scene we see today.
It's a fun symbol of the power of nature. It's not what you would call subtle, but then the places with the most impact seldom are. You could try and shoehorn in some anti-colonialist message here, but yeah, I think that would be kind of playing with the facts a little too much. Except that all things do fade eventually and fall back to nature. And apparently Tate & Co., the company that owned these warehouses, is still operational in Asia.
While perhaps not a satisfying allegory for the end of colonialism, the adjacent merchant house, built at the same time and not allowed to be reclaimed by nature, is a well-preserved example of European colonial architecture. I really liked the Anping Tree House. It was a strange sight, not just because of the trees growing through it, but because it was also a whisper of a far-off land. And you know, it's actually quite refreshing to see some British colonial architecture that was nothing to do with land grabs or subjugation. And they were just here to buy and export sugar and camphor. Looking at British history in the region can be stressful. Next was another familiar spot.
Now we've come to this place. It's called Chikan Tower, which is something a little bit rude in Japanese. But here it's this pretty pleasant temple place.
Yes, Chikan means something along the lines of public lewdness in Japanese. But these towers neatly tell the story of Taiwan's history.
It's an interesting place because it used to be a Dutch fort, but then they built this temple on top of the old remains.
Yeah, I think remnants was what I was going for rather than remains. But anyway, To be more specific, the Dutch built fortified trade buildings here in the 1600s. They were destroyed by earthquakes in 1862. The Qing built temples on top of the ruins. The Japanese made them into an army hospital and then renovated the temples. And now the current regime, call them what you will, have restored the structures as museums. So they're an interesting conglomeration of different cultures and purposes. And there's still a religious element here.
Got this nice shrine up here.
And down below they had begun to excavate the original fort, the one the Dutch built, to make sure that the local people didn't rebel too much and that got damaged by earthquakes.
You can see they're excavating the old ruins down there.
As usual for me, I was very pleased to see a whole lot of koi.
Hello fishies. Many hungry fishies. So many lovely fishies. Hello all you fishies. I remember these turtles from last time I was here. They've really changed the garden there.
Yes indeed, I had come here previously back in 2010, where I was also very interested in the fishies. Here's a group shot including my late grandma looking as impressed as ever. You can see that the garden looked very different and there was a large statue of the Dutch surrendering to Koxinga, which this time I had to go and find.
Last time I was here this statue was right in the middle, but they've changed for the excavations. Now it's tucked away around a corner. So there's been a big change since last time I was here. It'll be interesting to see how it is when I get back and this new excavation project is finished.
As for those interesting stone turtles, well, those are imperial stelae, sent by the Emperor Qianlong towards the end of the 18th century to mark the successful suppression of a rebellion of the Tiandihui, who I actually wrote about in my second novel. This one, wowee, yes I know, right?
Apparently these big turtle stones tell the story of Confucius quashing a rebellion and were commissioned by the emperor. No trembling.
And so our little day trip to Tainan came to an end. We saw a whole lot of interesting things, some less interesting ones as well, and generally it was a trip I'm glad I got to experience.
Looks like we're wrapping things up with that, but it's been a lot of fun. I've seen a lot of good stuff and I enjoyed today.
Can you tell I don't really like vlogging in public? Anyway, not just our day trip, but our whole Taiwan holiday had come to an end. I'll leave you with some final thoughts from the airport.
Alright, so we're leaving Kaohsiung International Airport now. I always like this airport for its Lilo and Stitch theming. Our flight leaves at 6:50 AM, 6:10 boarding time, so we had a pretty early start, kind of tired, but I'm looking forward to getting back to Japan. I guess that's it for this vlog. See you next time.